Hello, my name is Miss Choi, and for those who do not know me, I am the student teacher with Mr. H. And to those who know me, hello. I have never met any of you guys over virtual space because this is my first video lecture, so bear with me. And today I am going to be introducing to an exciting new unit called genetics. I'm really lucky to be sharing genetics with you as my first video lecture because it's a lesson that I feel very passionate about. It's very relevant to um, human lives. So I hope that you enjoy the lecture. So, genetics, what is it? It's a study of heredity. And heredity is basically the idea of how characteristics are passed from parents to offspring. So, we are looking at different characteristics that your parents have, and we're saying, oh, what characteristics are similar that you have now? And one of the things that we study is skin color. Um, and as you can see in this albino peacock, this people can be albino as well, and it's basically when you don't have any skin color pigments, so it shows up as white. And this is a characteristic that is passed from parents to offspring. As you guys may know, biologists have a lot of like terminology that we use, academic vocab, to describe certain things. And because these characteristics, which are passed from parents to offspring, is such an important word, we have a word for it, and this word is called traits. Um, and so traits can be so the some examples of heritable traits could be things like height. It could be like skin color, as mentioned. But it could also be things that are not necessarily visible right away. Like it could be sickle cell. It could be diseases like sickle cell anemia or like the likelihood of you getting breast cancer. And characteristics which are not considered to be traits could be things like scars, because if you fell over a playground when you were like 6, like I did, and you have a scar, that does not mean that your child, when they're born, will have the same scar that you do. Another one could be things like tattoos, or like if you decide to dye your hair in that like ombre, like unicorn color that's like in fashion right now, that does not mean your baby will come out with like some beautiful like unicorn hair, unfortunately or fortunately. One easy way to remember things that are traits versus things that are not traits is to actually think of my favorite book, Harry Potter. And so Harry Potter has green eyes, which are inherited from his mom. And so that is a trait. On the other hand, his scar that he got from Voldemort, the lightning scar, is not something that can be considered a trait because it's something that he has, but it will not be passed on to his future offsprings. Okay, so other vocabulary that I want you guys to know for the topic of genetics is gametes, which is the eggs or the sperm. It's basically the cells that contain the DNA that is going to allow you to inherit the characteristics from the parents to the offspring. And offspring is all the possible types of children that can be created with the gametes of these parents. Okay, so I have just explained that in the gametes, where it's like the eggs and the sperms from your mom and dad, um, they have DNA inside. And these DNA are specifically called chromosomes because they're condensed form of DNA. And I will tell you how DNA condenses in the next slide. So humans have 23 chromosomes. We have two sets, one from your mom and one from your dad. So as you can see from this chromosome number 1, it looks like an X shape. And the reason is because this part is from maybe your mom and this one is from your dad. So they're like the same chromosomes, but they're from two different people. And because of that, they're called homologous chromosomes. The number of chromosomes you have does not mean that the organism is more complex or less complex. Like, for example, we have 23 chromosomes, but a potato has 50 chromosomes, but that does not mean we are less complex than a potato. And similarly, actually, a banana has like 22 chromosomes. So the number of chromosomes we have don't necessarily determine how complex an organism is. And I want you to know that it is 23 because even though it says only up to 22, because X and Y are considered to be one chromosome, another set is called a sex chromosome, and that's your 23rd chromosome. Okay, so what is the relationship between chromosomes and DNA? Because I have just told you that chromosomes are technically DNA. And the reason is, you know DNA probably in this sort of a form from your cell bio, the previous units. And basically, these are strings of hair that are like everywhere inside the nucleus. And it gets very messy because if you have hair or string that's just like around everywhere, it's not organized. So when the cell goes through multiplication or cell division processes, it wraps around proteins, these circular proteins called histones, and they condense and condense and condense until they become chromosomes. Cool. So then a lot of people think, oh, then the entire chromosome must be a gene. But that is a big misnomer because it actually is not. So if we just look at one of the tinier chromosomes, chromosome 19, and if I look further, I know this is for humans, but it's okay. So in this chromosome, we'll say it's for plants. Pretend there's like a gene for flower color. Genes are basically a small section of DNA within a chromosome that codes for a protein. So not your entire chromosome codes for a protein. It's very specific subsections. This one is for flower color. There could be this one for like the size of a leaf. This one could be like the thickness of a xylem. And within this gene, there is variations that you can have. Like for flower color, you can have purple flowers, red flowers, white flowers. And the variation of these genes are called alleles. So in this chromosome, there's an allele for a purple flower. That's why it's like darker pink. And then this one, the allele is for white. And the reason that they're different is because the genetic code inside, because they're all DNAs, right? The DNA nucleotides, they're all sequenced in kind of a different order. Because they'll express a different kind of protein ultimately. Okay, so something to know is that trait and gene or allele is not exactly the same thing. Genes are basically the instructions to make a protein. It's like basically genes are your recipe book, and protein is like the birthday cake that you make from that recipe book. And these proteins will later on determine the trait. So by making birthday cake, it can determine how nice or not nice you are. So the trait and then becomes niceness. And the type of protein is, even if you have an instruction manual, it doesn't mean that your cake comes out perfect all the time. It could be a little burned on the side. It could be smashed. There could be a variation of how that protein is ultimately made. And it also does not tell you like how frequently that protein is going to be made. So it's possible that you make a cake for every single friend of yours, or you make a cake like every once in 10 years, and that will determine the trait of how nice you are in compare when you just look at the cake and in relation to your niceness. Similarly, with genes, when genes make a protein, the type of protein and the level at which this protein is expressed, which is called gene expression, determines the trait or how like blue your eyes will be. So an example is going back to the purple and the white flowers is that if there's an allele for a purple color, that will code for a protein or an enzyme that's going to help make a purple pigment. And an allele for a white will not have this kind of enzyme at all. So it will just show up as white because white is kind of our default color when you don't have pigments. Excuse me. Okay, so as you saw before, let me just go back really quick. In here, there's a homologous chromosome. So there's one for one of each parents, which means that, so what happens if like one side is like one allele is purple and the other allele is like white? And that's where the patterns of heredity come in. So pretend one of your parents has a red allele for flower color and a white allele for flower color. Sometimes the presence of just one allele is seen. Basically, it's the one that you have seen from the parents before. They're either white or red, okay? And that's considered to be a complete dominance. If it's something that's blended, the color, it's like a pink. It's basically, you haven't seen this color, but you know that when you mix red and white, you will get pink. That is considered to be an incomplete dominance or partial dominance. Whereas if both of them are seen in one flower, it could be striped, it could be spotted, but it has a mix of both red and white, but they're distinct colors. Like it's not pink, but it's red and white stripes or red and white dots or something like that. That is called codominance. So here's a check for an understanding. a plant with purple flowers is crossed with a plant with white flowers. The offspring has lavender flowers. This is an example of a kind of heredity. It's important when you do these kinds of questions for you to look at what color is the offspring and compare it to basically the colors that the parent has. Okay, and then we want you to do the same for offspring has flowers with both purple and white color, what that would be. So in this case, the offspring has has a flower that has both purple and white inside. Maybe it's purple stripes and white stripes, or purple dots and white dots. So what kind of an example would that be? And another one that I know isn't in your skeleton notes, but I figured it's really cute. And I also think it helps me remember some of the difference between complete and incomplete is this. This is obviously is not real. It's a joke. But what kind of heredity pattern would a panda be? Versus like if this black bear and this white bear were to cross and they made a gray bear, what kind of a pattern would that be? Okay, you can pause the video if you need more time. Okay, so as I have explained in genetics, basically genetics has a gene component part of it, and then this part that you see like as a trait. And so the part that we look at in terms of physical appearance or structure is called a phenotype. It's not sometimes always something that you see per se, but it's something that can be observable, maybe under a microscope, maybe through some blood testing data, or something that you can just see. And in this case, for this example, it would be the purple color of that flower. Whereas the genotype is basically looking at the chromosome and looking at the alleles that it has. In this case, for this purple flower, we're going to pretend that it has one allele from its dad, that's white, which is in a lowercase p, and one allele from its mom, and it's a bigger uppercase p. And so it has an uppercase p and a lowercase p. And based on these parent colors and based on the offspring color, can you figure out what pattern of heredity the flower color has? I feel like playing like Jeopardy music or something. Anyway. Okay, so it's complete dominance. And if you got it right, yay! If you didn't, it's okay. And the reason is because, as you can see, this color is not a new color. It's a color that we have seen before, but it's only one of the two. It's not a mix of two. So it is a complete dominance. And in this case, then you would say the bioterm that we want you to start using instead of using uppercase and lowercase p is that the uppercase P is then considered to be dominant, because when these two are mixed together, this color overwhelms this color, and so you only see a purple. Whereas the little p is considered to be recessive, and you always use dominant allele as capital, and then always use the recessive allele as lowercase. Means that they have homozygous dominant genotype, which means dominant, as stated, is capital letters, and homozygous means the same. You can have homozygous dominant, but you can also have homozygous recessive, which is basically two little p's. And if they are different, if there's one big P and one little p, that's called heterozygous. And you should know these terms because they're always used when you are doing genetics problems. So I'll just be like, hey, you mixed a homozygous dominant with a heterozygous. What do you get? And we expect you to know this vocabulary from this point onwards. Okay, so check for understanding. Remember that genotype is something that is in the genes, is in the alleles, and phenotype is a physical characteristic. Yeah. When they're asking for pattern of inheritance here, they're asking you, is it a complete dominant, incomplete dominant, codominant? I feel like this question gets a little confusing, but basically when an allele is recessive, it means that the protein is not produced because it gets masked, whereas a dominant one, the protein would be expressed. So based on that information, I think you can solve that problem. Okay, so this is the last two slides I have, and it's about basically misconceptions. So a lot of people think because in the entire genetics unit, we always say like, oh, this one gene, like the T allele, stands for height. So a lot of people think, oh, then I only need one gene from my parents to make me tall or short. But that is really not true. We simplify it because it makes your lives easier and it makes it easier for us to explain, but these are rare exceptions. In reality is always more complicated, and that genes are affected by multiple. So some genes affect multiple traits, or traits can be polygenic, which means that multiple genes can contribute to the same phenotype. So it takes like genes from chromosome 1, 4, 5 all coming together to make your height the way it is, or to make your skin color the way it is. That also said, it doesn't mean that genes, so if you have a likelihood of, say, breast cancer it runs in your family, that does not mean that you're going to get breast cancer. It gives you an increased likelihood of possibly getting it, but there is definitely a huge environmental factor that you have to consider as well. And that's really relatable, I think, when you look at twins, which I know this class has a ton of. And if you look at any twins that you know, even if they're identical, they're not always the same, and that depends on the environment and like the types of friends that they have, or the types of foods that they're introduced to, or the experiences that they have. Okay. Woo. Woo. Sorry about that. The lights suddenly went off, and I didn't want to create like a random horror scene out of nowhere. And so what I want to say is that genetics is a lot more complicated than just the genes that you inherit. It's also about the environment, and it will play a huge role in the types of traits that you will ultimately express and the person that you become. Okay, have a good Thanksgiving.